Hello there, and welcome to Speaking of Our Words, radio programming that brings you the wide range of voices, stories, and forms of local writers, and offering you some insight into their creative process. My name is Chris DeGuire. I teach creative writing workshops at Columbia College Chicago, and I am your host. We have several guests today, so why don't we get going? Okay. And our first guest today is Eric Charles May. Eric May is an associate professor of fiction writing at Columbia College Chicago. He is a Chicago native and former reporter for the Washington Post, and his fiction can be found all over the place. His debut novel, Bedrock Faith, is out now by Akashic Books. Eric, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Eric is a longtime friend of mine, too. I've known Eric for about 20 years. Eric May is also the sports guru. I believe Eric knows every play from every game ever.
Well, not quite that much. But...
So, Eric, tell us a little bit about your book, what your book is about.
Well, Bedrock Faith is a novel about a guy who is terrorizing his neighbors with the word of God. A fella gets out of prison after 14 years and moves back home with his widowed mom, and his staid middle-class African-American neighbors are a little worried because he was quite the trouble before he went away. But then they find out he's had a religious conversion while in prison. Later after that, he becomes far more of a danger to the neighborhood as a born-again warrior for God than he was when he was just a thug.
Mm-hmm. And there's some very funny moments in this book, too, some very serious moments as well. Yeah. One of the questions I want to ask you, Eric, is if you could talk a little bit about your choice of this sort of community voice that you use to tell this story. You mostly follow the point of view of Mrs. Motley, or at least it starts out that way and ends that way. But what led you to sort of tell the story with this community third-person voice?
Well, I mean, it's as much about how the community reacts to this character as it is anything the character does. It's almost like this back and forth kind of thing, is that the character does something, he gets into it with one neighbor after another, based on religious grounds. And of course, this is a very tight-knit African-American community, and it's one of those places that is, even though it's part of the city of Chicago, it's on the southern edge of the city. And so it is actually more like a small town, in the sense that everybody knows everybody else. Many of the residents have lived there for years, and so it's the kind of place where when something happens, everybody has an opinion on it. Mm-hmm. And so part of the story, I mean, the neighborhood, the community is almost like a Greek chorus of sorts, in which something will happen, and then so you have kind of like a double action, where this character whose name is Stewpot, he does something, causes something to happen on his block, and then something dramatic, and then the community has a response to that. So it's kind of like everything that happens, the community kind of weighs in one way or another. And so what you want to do, instead of just having a whole bunch of scenes where this character talks to this character, you kind of approach it from this group perspective. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the novels where you see this being done really, really well is in James Jones's novel, The Thin Red Line, in which he takes on the point of view of this infantry company, which in the novel is Charlie Company, or C for Charlie. And you'll have sections where C for Charlie thought this and C for Charlie thought that, and where he's taking this kind of group perception that isn't one soldier, but how the entire unit is kind of responding to what's happening to them. Mm-hmm. And of course other novels have done that, that kind of thing as well. Toni Morrison does it to some degree in her. You look at some of her novels, particularly you think of Sula, and also Song of Solomon, where there are points where what you're getting is how the community is responding to, the stuff that's going on in the story.
Yeah. I'm going to talk a little bit about how you decided to structure it as well in a few minutes here, but I'm curious, too, as to how some of the themes began to develop, because I also know that you spent a number of years working on this book, and
Yeah.
I want to talk about that in a few minutes too. But particularly the themes of religion and the theme of this sort of sense of right and wrong, where these characters, particularly Mrs. Motley feels that she's always, what she feels she's doing is always the right thing, and sometimes the results aren't always good, let's say.
Well, everyone, in this novel, including this character Stew Pot, who sets himself up as the sort of, he sets himself up as the moral judge and jury of the neighborhood. All of them have a bedrock faith that what they're doing is the right thing. He feels what he's doing is the right thing, and their responses to what he's doing, they feel are the right thing to do. And it's a novel in part about what happens when people get locked into this idea of right and wrong. And it's not just that what I think is right, I have to do it. I have to act on what I'm thinking, and that the kind of trap that can be. If we just get trapped into this whole idea of right and wrong, good and bad, which is not an argument for not taking a moral stand, but that sometimes just because we're right about something doesn't mean we have to foist it on everybody else.
Yeah.
Is the thing. That sometimes you have to pick your spots, and of course we've all known people who don't know how to do that. Wherever they are, wherever they're doing, they feel like they must assert whatever they think is the right thing, whether it's in the realm of what's going on politically, or what happens to be happening at the Thanksgiving Day table, or wherever they are.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of the novel is about that kind of, and the sort of thing that can happen when people get really locked into this idea of this is my bedrock faith and I'm not moving from it. Because it plays out in other aspects of the novel. It plays out in Mr. McTeer's relationship to Mrs. Motley, and some other things. It plays out to Mrs. Butler's attitude toward Mrs. Motley, and Alderman Pager, who plays a big role in the story too, of course.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And religion is, I grew up in a neighborhood where I had a 4-block walk to my grade school, and I had to pass 4 sizable churches to get there. And that didn't count the church that was at the other end of the block in the opposite direction, or the church that my family attended, which was 1 block directly south of the grade school. So it was a neighborhood in which religion was a huge part of it. I mean, so much a part of it that it wasn't even seen as something, wow, there's a lot of religion here. I mean, it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized, that I had to pass by 4 churches on the way to on the 4-block walk to school. It wasn't really something you thought about, because it was the religious part of it was woven so deeply into the just overall life of the community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, for this one, and religion is one of the things that people feel strongly about, but, it's the origin for the story came somewhat from, I saw something on the news years ago about a white kid in the South. Maybe he was 7 or 8 years old, I don't know. But he was terrorizing his classmates by telling them that they were all going to go to hell because they were not sufficiently religious. And, of course, some of these kids would come home crying to their parents, but there was nothing that the teachers at school could do, because that's where he was doing most of the terrorizing.
Mm-hmm.
Because he wasn't threatening to take the kids' lunch money or anything. And there was something about someone doing something to you that is wrong and hurtful, but the way they're doing it, you can't do anything about it. And so all of of these things kind of came into play as how I was going to go at this novel.
Mm-hmm. And was all that, were you taking all that into consideration when you were working on the first draft for this, or did that?
Well,
yeah,
I
just
knew
sort
what
of
the
develop?
story was going to be. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I knew that he was going to come. I was going to have this guy come out of prison, and the reason that I wanted him to have come out of prison was that was the most convenient way to just introduce him, throw him into the neighborhood. In other words, if he had lived in the neighborhood his whole life, by the time he was an adult, the neighbor would have figured out a way to deal with him. What I wanted was to have somebody show up and just start upsetting apple carts.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, well, how can I have this? But I wanted him to be from the neighborhood, too. I didn't want him to be a total stranger. And I said, well, gee, how can I do that? How can I have somebody be from a neighborhood, but, okay, well, maybe he went away. Where did he go away to? And I said, oh, well, prison, And because I thought that was such a marvelously incongruent thing to have, tied to the religion thing. So
mm-hmm.
I kind of said, well, okay, this might be a way to do that in a way that would give me the most opportunity to exploit things dramatically.
Mm-hmm. And you have a number of characters in this book, and what I'm curious is about some of these characters. We get their entire names:
Mm-hmm.
Vernon Pager, Irma Smedley, a handful of others, and
mm-hmm.
the children. We get their names, but almost everyone else is either Mr. McTeer or
mm-hmm.
Mrs. Butler. How did you come to choose that way to keep the characters in line or to keep them manageable?
One part was to keep them manageable,
mm-hmm.
Because it's actually easier if you have a character that has one name. It's a lot easier to deal with them.
Mm-hmm.
But also, traditionally, I remember my mother telling me at one time how when she was growing up, the women in the neighborhood that she was raised, which is the same neighborhood I grew up in, back then the tradition was if two women in the neighborhood had grown up together, they called each other by their first names. But if they had not grown up together, they called each other Mrs. or Ms. or Miss. Yeah. And because there was a kind of a formality that was kind of a tradition, and that I still see in African Americans of that age, where they will refer to someone as Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so if they're not someone that they were raised with and haven't become, close friends with, like someone they know from church or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And but it would serve two purposes. It was kind of growing out of that tradition, and it just was easier. I knew I was going to have a lot of characters, and this just made it easier to keep the characters straight for me and the audience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about how you decided to structure the novel too, Eric. You've got it divided into sections, I believe 10 or 11 sections,
mm-hmm.
and each section is divided into chapters, and every chapter has a little title that sort of gives a bit of summary as to what is going to happen or possibly happen there. How did you choose to come to that structure?
Well, again, I knew I was going to have the novel moving around to different characters, and so each section, which I call a book, has, it's one section is Stewpot versus Irma Smedley. The other one is Stewpot versus the Davenports. The other one is Stewpot versus Mrs. Hicks. And one of them is, the neighborhood strikes back.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it made it easier for me, first of all, to just know, okay, in this section it's going to be about this. In this section it's going to be about that. And also so that the reader would know as soon as they went to a new section, okay, this is what this is going to be about. This is where we're going to be, because I had characters, we start off with Mrs. Motley, but then she kind of is not a main character
mm-hmm.
in the next 2 or 3 sections.
Yeah.
But then I wanted to bring her back, of course, later. So that way I can, each section of the novel, in one section a character will come forward and be the focus, and then in other sections they will retreat, and other characters will come forward and be the focus.
Mm-hmm.
And it just made it organizationally, with so many characters, it just made it a lot easier to deal with for me.
Yeah, I thought it made very clear. I'm interested in your rewrite strategies for this book, Eric, because I know you started this book. I remember you reading excerpts from it many years ago, back in the day. So what I'm curious is about, how did you go about rewriting whatever the first draft you had, or how did you compensate for changes in your own voice or your own style or anything else that might have come up in the time period from when you started this book to when it was published?
Well, I finished the first draft in the late fall of 2009. I was on sabbatical, and I finished it then, and then I let it sit for a while, because you reach a point where you can't really see it or hear it, and you need to let it sit for a while, for months, and then come back to it, and then try to say, okay, what do I have here? Because when you start revising, which sometimes means excising certain things, you don't want to be doing it blind, or you can wind up, instead of cutting fat, you can wind up cutting, meat and bone. So I did that, and then I went back at it, and then, of course, the first time through, you're just trying to clean up, any typos that may still exist, or word clumsies, although, that getting the word clumsies out is a extended process. And then I wound up with a manuscript that I knew was too long. It was well over 500 manuscript pages. And I said, well, I don't know if any publisher is going to accept a first novel that's 500 plus pages, even though I thought it was a pretty good book, So I said, well, what is it that I can live without? What's the story that I want to tell? Is there any way I can tell what I want to tell quicker? What characters do I absolutely need? And the characters that I didn't absolutely need, I removed from the cast. And I had a whole other family that lived there on that block, that had a whole storyline where Stupak winds up getting this guy fired from his job because of something that Stupak does. But I decided that, I could, while that was good stuff and it was some wonderful scenes, it was really, in some way, just another version of what happens with the character Mr. Davenport. And so I decided that while it was good, I could live without it. And so I took that family out of the story. And then you start looking at scenes and saying, okay, what purpose does this scene serve? And this is where you get into issues of causality, and where every scene has to have causality of some sort. It either has to cause something to happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise, or it causes something not to happen that would have. And I would ask myself, gee, if I take this scene out of the story, what effect does it have? And if the answer to that question was, well, it doesn't really affect the story much at all, then you have to really ask yourself, well, then does it need to be in the story? If it's not having any, in other words, if you take the scene out and it doesn't affect the story at all, then does the scene really need to be there? So I did that, and then you get in and you start tightening language, and you start saying, well, gee, is there a quicker way or more expeditious way something I can do to have this storyline happen? And I finally got it down to 440 pages. And then after I had sent it to the publisher and it was accepted for publication, and this was last summer, summer of 2013, I sat down and read it 4 times over the course of about a month. The last 3 times I read it aloud. I would just sit down at a table, or at a desk, and I would just read it aloud with a pencil and making any notes that I noticed. And I didn't. That process did not allow me to change anything structurally, but I cleared up a lot of word clumsies and also saw a couple of continuity. Well, actually, more than a couple. A few continuity issues. I had Alderman Pager one age early on in the novel and a different age later in the novel. I had Mrs. Motley totally not mentioning something that any sensible person would have mentioned to a granddaughter who's going to move to Oklahoma and likes cowboys. So I was able to come in, and I was able to get in something about the character Reggie Butler, because something happens to him that the neighborhood is profoundly aware of and is reacting to profoundly, but I didn't have anything in there about what his reaction was. And I realized, oh my goodness, I got to get in something about how this kid is reacting to what has happened to him. And they're little things, but they're things that I feel very strongly made Bedrock Faith a much better book. I'm really, really happy that I went through that process. It was never tedious, but it was, you're sitting there reading the thing aloud, to yourself. I mean, that's work. But it was time well spent, because it's a much, much better book for my having gone through that process.
And that all certainly comes through in the reading of it too, Eric. Eric, you've been giving some great advice here. What other advice would you have for anyone who's been working on a project for some time? I know, because we both teach, and one of the things I know we talk about with our students is how writing needs time to gestate. It needs to live and breathe on its own. It needs to be set aside for a while. But for someone who's maybe started something, a few years ago, maybe they abandoned it and they want to go back to it. What's maybe some other advice that you might have for someone like that?
Go back to it.
Mm-hmm.
It won't write itself.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like the most obvious advice to give, but that's the thing to do. Sometimes when the writing sits and we think about it and we think about it and as years have gone by, and the project, to get it done, grows in our imagination. Mm-hmm. And it becomes this Mount Everest, and we feel like, oh my God, I could never. And then, but sometimes if we just go back to the work and roll up our sleeves and get involved in the nuts and bolts of producing the writing, we realize, oh, you know what? Actually, this wasn't as big a deal as I thought it was. And then sometimes, of course, life intrudes. There are reasons sometimes why we put writing down. Sometimes we put it down because we just haven't figured out how to do it. Sometimes we put it down because life intrudes. Mm-hmm. Real life issues come up, involving work or relatives or marriage or health or any number of things, and we have to put the writing aside. But sometimes the thing to do is to just go back to it and to not put too much weight on yourself, or not feeling like, well, I'm 35 and I'm not famous yet. It's too late for me to go back to that. I mean, my first novel was published about a month before my 61st birthday, and it's no less sweeter for the wait. Mm-hmm. Now, would I have liked to have had something like that happen when I was, 31? Sure. But if I had taken the attitude of, oh, it's too late for me at age 50, I never would have gotten the novel done and gotten to all the wonderful things that have happened to me so far as a result of its being published. So the advice I would give, if you have some material sitting out there, is go back to it, and you may be surprised. You may be surprised by, oh wow, this isn't really all that bad, or parts of it really aren't all that bad, or the time that you spent away from it may tell you. You may have a clear idea of now what needs to be done. You may have a clearer idea of, oh, okay, this is actually where the story is, or this is what I actually need to focus on, and get back to it. But again, don't put too much pressure on yourself. I mean, life hands us enough pressures. We don't have to take our artistic process and make that something else to be up to worry over and fret over and obsess about.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means, you have a job, you have a life. You may only have 20 to 30 minutes a day to work on something. If that's all the time you have, then that's all the time you have.
Yeah.
And Toni Morrison, at one point in her life, she had 2 young kids, neither one of them in school. She had a full-time job. She would get up early in the morning and write for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then get her kids off to daycare, and then do her full-time job. She was a book editor. And then she would come home in the evening and, do what single mothers have to do with their young kids. And that's how she wrote The Bluest Eye. So there's, because sometimes what keeps us from the writing is I don't have enough time.
Mm-hmm.
Where I don't have the day upon day of 4-hour blocks of time where I can sit down and just devote to it. And you don't necessarily. I mean, it's great if you have it, but that's not necessarily required to get the writing done. You can get a lot written over the course of 3 or 4 months if you're just writing for 20 or 30 minutes 5 days a week. And because sometimes that's the only way to get it done, because we're busy doing other things. But what I found is when I'm writing, even when I'm writing in small increments, that makes all the other stuff that's not so much a creative process or fun a lot more, I guess, tolerable. When we're doing something that gives us joy, and when we're doing something that's good for our creative soul, it actually makes some of the other stuff that maybe is not doing that so well easier to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say, look at your week schedule and say, well, okay, when do I have some free time on my Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday? And again, it may only be 20 or 30 minutes. It may only be 15. You can get 3/4 to a page written in 15 minutes.
You can get a lot more done than you think you can.
Yeah, a lot more done than you think you can. And don't worry about it, and don't obsess about it, and don't beat yourself up because you don't have voluminous amounts of time to sit back and just write for hours every day.
Yeah. Well, very excellent advice. Eric May, thank you very much for being on the show. The book is Bedrock Faith. It's available everywhere. The Facebook page is Eric Charles May, and I know you put up times when you're doing readings in the Chicago area and things like that.
If you check out the Akashic Books website,
mm-hmm.
and if you go to, they have sections for all of their authors, and if you go to mine and just go to M, and part of that will be a listing of where I'm reading, both in the Chicago area and if folks are traveling, anywhere else.
All right, well, very good. Eric May, thanks again so much for being on the show.
Oh, hey, thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me. This has been great.
Yes, very good. Thank you.
All right,
take care. Bye-bye. You are listening to Speaking of Our Words. And now we're going to move into the open mic portion of the show, and our first reader is going to be Walter Gascoigne. Hello, Walter.
Hi, Chris.
Walter, what do you have for us today?
This is something completely different for me. It's a memoir.
All right, Walter Gascoigne, take it away.
It's called The Most Frightening Thing I Have Ever Seen. When I was young, my family would gather together on weekends at Granny's house. She was actually my great-grandmother, but everyone who came to her house knew her as Granny. Even her neighbors called her that. She was around 5 feet tall, somewhere in her 90s, and her authority was unquestionable. She would not even have to speak, just a glance from her, and you knew if you did something wrong. She treated everyone who walked through the door equally. No one was judged or made to feel out of place. It was somewhere anyone could call home, and many people did. If anyone needed a place to sleep, something to eat, or just some idle chit-chat to pass the time away, they went to Granny's. There was always a pot of coffee brewing and a beer in the fridge for anyone who wanted one. Pictures of the family lined the walls. Ashtrays were piled on the dining room table where she held court. The air was perpetually filled with smoke as she lit one cigarette after the other. A coffee mug and a shot glass sat on the table in front of her at all times. The inevitable deck of cards and game of Yahtzee were within easy reach of the table. Often laughter could be heard from within the house. Other times singing, but most always there would be conversation. People talking to one another in their little groups, or everyone all joining in on the same topic. It was a magic place, a place where you could forget your individual troubles and be part of something larger, part of a family. Now you may be wondering why I would name this story the most frightening thing I have ever seen if it was such a wonderful place full of wonderful people. I will tell you why. My parents were still married at the time, and my grandmother, from my father's side, lived next door to her granny. I spent many a weekend at my grandma's house, and every morning we would go over to Granny's after she made us breakfast. She would drink coffee, and I would sit with them at the table, fidgeting while they discussed the news or who was going to marry whom. My great-aunt, sister to my grandma, lived in the house with Granny too, so the three of them could be found on any given morning sitting around the table doing what family does best, being together. I cannot recall how old I was when Granny passed away, but I remember feeling very tiny and insignificant as people came and went from her house, talking about Granny and the things she said to them in the past. People came and went all day, until at nightfall only the closest relatives remained. My father was among them. My father was a big, burly man, known for his toughness, resilience, and strength. I had never seen him shed a tear, even after I hooked his thumb completely through with a lure on a fishing trip. That night, I watched him break down and sob. Great heavy shudders ran through his body, the tears pouring from his face, as he and my grandmother held each other. It scared the crap out of me. I was horrified. The man who I thought was the strongest person on earth was in tears and blubbering like a baby. I wanted to go hug him and tell him it would be all right, but I was too scared. I felt very small. I was a coward for not being there when he needed me. All I could do was stand there and try not to cry myself. I wanted to be strong for him so he would be all right again. That was the most frightening thing I'd ever seen in my whole life up until that point. Watching the man whom I thought was beyond pain or suffering hurt so bad on the inside, and me unable to do anything to comfort him. At the funeral there were tears in the eyes of the crowd, but my father kept his in check, and in his silence retained his strength and kept my fears at bay. I was very close to my grandma. I spent almost every weekend of my youth at her house, and most of my summers too, sweating in the heat, and in the winter bundling up against the chill. We would play cards and dominoes. We would watch TV together, laugh together, argue together. My daughter was not yet 1 when she passed away. I don't remember much of the funeral. I do remember that I was a pallbearer along with my father and his brothers. I don't remember crying, even though I had just lost my best friend in the world. Maybe I was trying to be strong. Maybe I was still in shock. I wasn't sure which. I do remember the family getting together afterward, people talking about her life, how wonderful she was, and the things she had accomplished. I saw my father hugging his brothers, but I remember there being no tears like with Granny. Perhaps they cried alone, away from everyone else, so as not to frighten them. I know I did not shed a tear that day, and I thought there must be something wrong with me. Now I realize why. I was trying not to frighten myself. My father passed away several years ago. I did not cry at his funeral either. The sense of loss was still there, but the tears remained hidden. I needed to stay strong for my daughter and for myself. I did not want to feel afraid. Today I have just returned from my great-aunt's funeral, the last of the sisters, and the last bit of glue which held that side of the family together. I watched at her wake as tears came to my uncle's eyes, and once more I was scared, this time not for him, but for me. I wondered about my own mortality, and who would be crying at my funeral. I wondered if I will ever see any of my relatives that at one time were so close, now so distant in miles that separate us. No more will everyone gather at the old house to talk and laugh, to share complaints and companionship. It remains empty and silent, waiting to be sold. the ghosts of those who lived there whispering their encouragement and keeping an eye on the family until then. I'm frightening myself right now. I cannot stop crying as I write this. At one time I thought I was strong, like my father. Now I see it is not a lack of strength why I cry. It is losing something that you can never get back, and being afraid that I may be the next to go. Tell my daughter, if she reads this, that it's okay to cry. It's not a sign of weakness, but a show of strength. Strength that she can remember the good times we had, and that one day, all we know goes away, but never in our thoughts or our hearts. Tell her it's okay to be afraid. It means you are alive. It means something mattered to you, and that by remembering, we let those we love who have died live on through us. Tell her it's okay to be frightened.
Walter Gascoigne, thank you very much. You are listening to Speaking of Our Words. And our next reader is their first time on the show is Tammy Peacy. Hello, Tammy.
Hello.
Tammy, what do you have for us today?
I have a short story that was published in Straylight magazine, which is Parkside's literary magazine, in May of 2013. It's called Fred.
All right, very good. Tammy Peacy, take it away.
Fred eats lunch in his car parked nose to lake. Sirens call and his eyes answer. There's an ambulance, followed by the fire engine, followed by 2 fast blue cruisers. Lights and vans and trucks shoot past, aimed at Fish River. Fred chews the last dry bite of a sandwich, swallows a swig of Coke, crushes his lunch trash down into a bag and tosses it to the floor mat. Time to head back to his phone and his desk. Fred once ran his own business. It was a used car dealership. Not now. To avoid the large parking lot and the building with windows displaying only the empty, he does his shopping on the other side of town. Fred sells ads for a bi-weekly paper owned by his brother. Interviews, photos of local people drunk in bars, Fred's ads, the cable schedule. Fred's brother Eric has papers like this set up in cities throughout the country. Eric offered Fred a share, but Fred said, "No thanks." A young man named Joe became his brother's new partner. The ads are easy to sell. It was all he could get after all of his troubles. People ask, "How's work?" Fred says, "Pays the bills." It's true and the most civil answer he can give. "Hey there, Tom, it's Fred. Fred Hansen. Business is okay?" "That's right, it's about that time." Sure. Did you want to go color on this one?" "No, not too much more. I can get a quote if you—" "Well, next time then." "We'll do the quarter page, same as before. I can send over a proof." "Yeah, we can run it just the same." "Thanks, Tom. Hey, you too." During the calls, he smiles, and he smiles at Joe, who walks by and gives Fred a double thumbs up, but Fred does not smile much at all after. When he first started, Fred went in person to sell ads. He saw too many people he knew from his car days, and some from his time in jail. The car days people were worse than the jail days people. Worst was the wife of the man he had killed. The wife, the widow, she'd sat in a booth in a coffee place, her hand around a cup with a tag slung over the fat rim. Her face held over the steam, eyes closed but not still. He tries but doesn't remember her name. She'd never written a name or address on the mail she'd sent. Joe said it would be no problem for Fred to work from his desk. Fred used to grind through life the same way he chewed a stick of gum. He lost the taste for it, but he went on. He chewed and lived, and it all came apart. In his first go at it, a fight was worth the minute it took to roll up his sleeves. He's frugal with his time these days. Push his sleeves back to fix a leak, to fetch a kid's wandering ball from a storm drain. There's been that mistake, and he won't forgive. Maybe he should, but he can't be certain. Sometimes he feels like he could, and sometimes all he can think is, has the lasagna in the fridge gone off, or is it still good to eat? His weeks are full of favors to these new people, called his friends, neighbors. No, he doesn't own a truck, but he will borrow one to help Mary with her move. Pretends he likes kids to sit for Greg and Joanne. Yes, he'll drive 20 minutes out of his way for 10 days straight to feed Paul's cat while Paul reclines on some secluded beach in Mexico. Into its mouth and down the animal's snarling throat, Fred will push pills and keep the cat's box very clean. When he got out of jail and Fred saw his wife's new apartment, a space that would have fit one corner of her real home, Fred's heart stalled and made a sound in his head, a thud. The words he managed were ruined. "Well, you unruin us then," Rachel said, her hand cool against his cheek. Her way was to be practical, to be the person who does not fracture. Fred used to think it was the way Southern women were, but now he thinks it was how she was. When they found cancer rooted to her bones, overlooked for all of her work keeping the tattered ends of their life from further unfurling, she stayed Fred's Rachel. Her last inhale was exhaled to instruct Fred on how dishes should be loaded in the new dishwasher. Fred stacks the cups and glasses on the top rack, plates and bowls go below. Pots and pans are washed by hand, but Rachel's request, though he does remember her palm on his face, he would not know where to start without her, or why he ought to bother. That guy there, holding the cup of soda with a wedge of lime, pretending it's gin and tonic, that's Fred. Fred's a man so scared of conflict, he'll do what it takes. Attends impromptu backyard parties like this one he'd rather not be party to. Visits with people he calls his friends and neighbors. He's never had a problem with drinking, just doesn't want to start one now. Tonight, he'll walk his neighbor's niece down the street to piano lessons. He'll wait the hour it takes and walk her back. Then Fred will paint for another neighbor, the handrail of his concrete stoop. His paint strokes, rhythmic, up and then down, will lend Fred's thoughts to his guilt and to reflect on how it has spurred all of his favor doing. He's sure it doesn't matter why he puts forth these good efforts, doesn't think the cause detracts from the act, doesn't want to deem his actions pretext. As soon as he was able, he had moved Rachel from the small apartment to the little house next to this bigger one with the rail he washes white, in this nice place full of nice people. He'll have to leave this house, move to a small apartment like the one Rachel rented when Fred was away. Fred will fill boxes with what he'll need for his next go at life. He'll leave what's carried over from the old, except the widow's many envelopes. Oddly thick at their centers, forwarded from jail, envelopes, those with their bellies slit and those intact. These white envelopes, they will be the last part of this life Fred dissects. But before that can happen, he will give until he's emptied of remorse, until there is no sorry remaining. It will not be guilt which drives him toward the anger or pain she's given. He fondles the near emptiness as his arm works up. He's close. He brushes down. He is further hollowed.
Tammy Peacy, thank you very much. Tammy, do you have a website or a collection, anything you'd like to plug?
I have a website. It's tammypeacy.com. It's Peacy, and it's Tammy with a Y. So it's TAMMYPEACY.com. That's, yeah, sorry.
Very good. Tammy, thank you very much. You are listening to Speaking of Our Words, and next up is Jim Janus. Hello, Jim.
Hi, Chris.
Jim, what do you have for us today?
I have a poem called August.
All right, Jim Janus, take it away.
The air arrives at the lake shore from hours of traveling over the vast, bright blue and a million white glints. It swirls the sand and the hair of a boy, stooped for a smooth stone, blue-gray like his sweater. The air flows over the dirty white boulders, where an orange and black butterfly flaps, then glides into the breeze. The air moves through the grass and the parallel tracks from the mower, releasing an aroma that's sweet like tobacco from a pipe. It sweeps the cuttings from an open picnic table and clears the painted green top for my notebook. Like the air knows I'm looking for an outdoor desk, and this with a seat on either side, a choice of what to face. Dogwood and green leaves, where a bird, greenish yellow and black masked, flutters to steal dark berries. Or the waves and a single sail, gray in a shadow, and at the tiller a red speck, a man steering away. Or my realization that for the lake and the sky and the trees and the birds, this weekday is no different than those when I was a child. But for me to see it the same, I first need the air to rush through my mind and to take with it what's there.
Jim Janus, thank you very much. Now, Jim, you have a blog?
Yeah, it's jimswriting.com.
All right, very good. Jim Janus, again, thank you very much. You are listening to Speaking of Our Words, and next up is Darleen Coleman. Hello, Darleen.
Hi, Chris.
Darleen, what do you have for us today?
I have a chapter from a novel,
right,
possibly a novel
possibly.
in progress.
All right, very good. Darleen Coleman, take it away.
The day after my 36th birthday, I'm walking home from the university library where I work shelving books, just like I did when I was a junior in high school. Only now, instead of extra credit, I get a check. We are here in Stevens Point, Wisconsin, 4 blocks south of the university, because Jack, my husband, was supposed to be head of the English department. Sometimes you know things before you think you do, like I must have known not to unpack most of our moving boxes. It feels too cold for October, but then I'm still not used to living this far north. There's been a miserable drizzle all day, making the library an even safer haven. Now the clouds lift, exposing the setting sun, which casts an eerie, brilliant light that makes me wonder just what is real. The sky's such intense cerulean, it could be a movie backdrop, the oaks and maples flaming in phosphorescent props. It chills me to the bone to know in half an hour the light will be gone, like the poof of an old flash camera leaving things frozen in blinding light. My arms turn gooseflesh beneath itchy wool. I am primed for something to happen. I feel weighty, breathless, centered, electrified, all at once. These moments are familiar. I know well the feeling of imminent change. My throat tightens at the smell of musty, burning leaves, and I know, in this moment, it's time to cut my losses and leave Jack. Life is made up of moments, my daddy told me, bits and pieces full of completion. Once, the summer I was 10, Daddy and I were walking down the beach at Nag's Head on the North Carolina coast, looking for shells for my collection. Look down the beach far as you can, Marianne. Imagine that beach is your life, all stretched out in front of you, one grain of sand blending into all the others. He pointed to something ahead, sparkling in the sun. I ran to see, expecting someone's lost diamond ring. The piece of beach glass was transformed jewel-like in the light. Beautiful moments, sparkly bits, days like jewels you'll never forget. He noticed my disappointment. A piece of glass as pretty as an emerald, if you see it in the right light, honey. All my life I've tried to see things in the right light. Our rented house is dark as I approach. It's a nasty old house. The woodwork thick and dark as licorice, the floors bulged and creaking. All the walls papered in tiny muted prints. Sometimes I lay half awake at night and the bedroom's pattern moves like thousands of insects. Jack loves the house. Such character, he shouted on moving day, shoving aside our things to finger the window's wide sashes like a mad blind person. God, look at these bookshelves. His brown eyes were wide, nearly black. Hey, my desk was made for this alcove, babe. I had willed myself to relax into Jack's quick embrace, allowed myself to be caught up in his romanticism. Weren't writers supposed to live in drafty old Victorians? Didn't Jack suffer through 3 years of the whitewashed tracklit Chicago loft for my sake? I start to light a fire before I take off my jacket. Before I realize, Jack is sitting in the dining room, next to my untouched birthday cake, the one he made for me yesterday. The icing is dulled, pale pink with green leaves and white flowers with yellow candy centers, daisies, my favorites. I can't yet believe something like this could come out of Jack. I didn't know you were home. Why the hell didn't you say something? I feel little zaps of electricity like I could kill Jack by pointing my finger at him. First cake I ever make for a woman, and she cries all over it. I don't need the light on to know that Jack's been drinking. Your dad sent a gift. He waves toward the couch in the front parlor. I s'pose you'll like it better than mine, he slurs. You didn't get me anything, Jack. I gave you a cake. I made you something. I put my soul into that cake. Cut the crap, sweetie. What'd you tell me as you were lighting the candles? Let me guess, you don't remember. After 35, chances of having a kid with birth defects are 1 in 15, babe. That's what you said. Jack slouches, his head wobbling. I stomp into the parlor and grab the cardboard box addressed to me, touching the return address lightly before ripping it open. Styrofoam pellets fall out all over the carpet, and some stick to my arms. It's a slim, sterling silver framed photograph of Jack and me sitting at the edge of a fishing pier last June in North Carolina. My hair caught in a ripple of wind. I'm smiling broadly at the camera. Jack's arms are wrapped around me. He's grinning, and his eyes have that boyish wistfulness I've noticed often while making love. I sit before the fire. tears sliding off my cheeks. After a long while, I stretch my cramped legs and feel Jack behind me. He has changed his clothes and has put on the sweater with the elbow patches I bought him when we moved. His breath is overwhelmingly minty now as he nuzzles my hair. Oh, babe, my sea sprite, my Mary Ann down by the seashore sifting sand. I love you so much, more than anything, more than this stupid job that isn't. We'll be okay. Tell me we're going to be okay, babe. The amber light of the fire has transformed the room. Jack's hair shines like a raven's, the gray at the temples becomes silver. Shadows play nicely over his cheekbones, giving him a hungry, wanton look. Too bad we can't live our whole lives in candle and firelight. I shiver in spite of the warmth at the touch of lamb's wool surrounding me, my Jack of all trades, master of my heart.
Darleen Coleman, thank you very much. You are listening to Speaking of Our Words, and our final piece today is from Richard Bell. Richard Bell is a regular contributor to the show, but he cannot be here today, so I will be reading his story called The Tortoise and the Hare, modern version. One summer day, Mr. Hare was bragging to all the animals about how fast he was. He said he could run circles around everyone, especially Mr. Tortoise. "You think you're pretty fast?" asked the tortoise. "Well, maybe you'd like to make a little bet on that. I think I could beat you in a race." This made the other animals laugh. "How much you want to bet?" asked the tortoise. "How about 100 heads of lettuce?" replied the hare. "Who else wants a piece of this bet?" All the animals chipped in, and the fox held their markers. The bluebirds mapped out the course from start to finish and set the race time for 8 a.m. the next morning. That night, at the local bar, the tortoise kept buying the hare beers and shots, and it wasn't long before the hare was passed out drunk in the alley. The next day found them both at the starting line. The hare had a huge hangover, but was confident he could win. He figured that even his grandmother, running uphill backwards, could beat this stupid tortoise. The fox did a countdown and yelled, "Go!" and the tortoise took his first little step. The hare sprinted ahead 10 feet and turned around to look at the tortoise. This was so easy, it wasn't even fair. The hare hopped on ahead a little more and came upon some cabbages in the field, so he turned in for a snack. With a full tummy and the warm sun shining down, he felt tired. He looked for the tortoise and saw it was only a short way from the starting line, so the hare closed his eyes and took a snooze under a shady tree. That's when the hangover really kicked in, and the hare was out like a light. All morning he dozed peacefully, and then woke when a little bee flew up his nose. He started running and caught up with the tortoise at the halfway mark of the race. "Give up yet?" asked the hare. "No way," replied the tortoise, and continued on. The hare looked ahead and saw his favorite bar, so he ran in for a shot and a beer. Someone played a good song on the jukebox, and everyone started dancing. In the background, Mrs. Tortoise kept putting in dollar bills and playing songs to keep the hare occupied. 2 hours later, she accidentally played Born to Run by Springsteen, and the hare remembered the race and hopped outside. He saw the tortoise on a skateboard racing downhill towards the finish. The hare started running like crazy, but it was too late. The tortoise had won. Now everyone was laughing at Mr. Hare over his epic fail, so the next day the hare went out and bought a gun. And that is from Richard Bell. Rich, thank you very much, wherever you are. All right, I'd like to bring back Jim Janus for a moment here. Jim Janus is a member of the board of directors of the Kenosha Writers Guild. Jim, if someone wants to join the Kenosha Writers Guild, what do they need to do?
All they need to do is show up to a meeting. The Kenosha Writers Guild meets on the second and third Thursday of every month. The third Thursday of the month is what we call our open meeting, so you can come in. If you have a piece of writing, you can bring it along and read it, share it. Otherwise, you can just come in and listen to what other people are reading. That second Thursday of the month, we do either in-depth critiques or we have guest speakers or workshops.
And the in-depth critique is actually a submission process. People get to read your work ahead of time and then come in and make comments on it.
Correct. And you can find that information on our Facebook page. And also we have KenoshaWritersGuild.com is our website, and all that information is out there.
All right, very good. Jim, thank you very much. And thank you very much to all of our guests today: Eric Charles May, Walter Gascoigne, Tammy Peacy, Jim Janus, Darleen Coleman, and Richard Bell. If you have any questions or comments or wish to participate on this program, please visit KenoshaWritersGuild.com and come to one of our meetings, and visit our Facebook page, Speaking of Our Words. Thanks to Dave Cole and WGTD, Steve Brown, Nita Hunter, our engineer Troy McDonald, Lisa Adamowitz-Kless, and the Kenosha Writers Guild. This is Chris DeGuire, and the world needs your stories. We will see you again soon. Thanks.